I think that's it, and I think that that's the point, that the individualism is normalized in the culture. But when something normalized like that begins to meet the shadow motivations, then you get a pathologized form of that same essential thing. So you could say that what we're seeing in the psyches of the mass shooters is something like the deep shadow of the individualistic way of American life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course that shadow, it can be individual or it can be collective, and I think that in some ways these kinds of events are exactly where those two are meeting, where both of them are rising up at the same time and kind of colliding, the individual's own personal shadow and then the collective cultural shadow that has really created an environment in which these kinds of things can happen.
Yes, and I think, though, that there's a lot of resistance to one of the things we want to do in the aftermath of these events is to, and I think it's understandable because we try to come up with explanations and so forth. So putting it on the head of one crazy person is, of course, one of those explanations. But, and I want to say this carefully, there's a sense in which there's still a scapegoating dynamic that goes on with that. From the cultural point of view, if the culture is not taking responsibility for the roots, the deep roots of the background of these individuals, another way to put this is that the fantasy of taking back, taking revenge for one's alienation is generated somewhere, and that process of generation, I think, is a cultural one. It's not just, we can't just put it in the hands of the individual.
Yes, I'm really interested in, well, let me just read something that you wrote actually in the article. This is going back to when you're talking about bullets, of course, and projectiles. And you say, projectiles are fired when the imagination can see no option but continued forward movement, when the only way out of a predicament is to move ahead by targeting, then removing the objects in your way. And then you go on to say, objectification and distancing, projection and projectiles go together. Your victims are the disagreeable parts of your inner pantheon in need of a lightning bolt or two. And I think that this sums up very well what may be happening on an archetypal level for the shooter, but what you just said about how we sort of scapegoat sometimes people that, who are doing these kinds of acts is also a way of not really claiming our own responsibility in the whole creation of this, because you're right, by putting labels on people, it enables us to actually objectify them sort of in a similar way, in the sense that we can say, oh, that's something else, it's not me, it's not, I'm different than them, I'm better in some ways. And so that objectification becomes a way for us to actually deal with it and make ourselves okay with what's going on. But we really need to look at what part we're playing in this when we're just calling somebody by a label that we don't want to be associated with.
Well, I think you've very well described the vicious circle around this phenomenon, which reaches beyond the individual. And if someone were to say to me, the three largest factors that go into the gun violence problem, and I would talk about the alienation. It pertains more to mass shootings, I think, than to maybe other situations. The expediency of the gun, the part of this idea that there's a fantasy behind the use of guns. Part of what empowers that fantasy is the idea of having a quick, expedient means to resolve, what may be a messy, complicated problem. But the third factor is the tendency to objectify. And the thing I think that connects all acts of gun violence is that at the moment the trigger is pulled, the gun is being aimed at an object and not a person. That in the mind of the killer, and this is true even for what we might say are legitimate examples of shooting that a policeman may have to undertake or a soldier who goes to war, they're not shooting complex individual people with families and histories. They're shooting the enemy, or they're shooting the criminal, or they're shooting the person who's about to do something destructive. And of course, in the backstories of a lot of these mass shootings, that kind of objectification is exactly what has taken place before they go in and shoot the co-workers or the cliques and groups in the high school or whatever it is. They've objectified their target. And so we can look at that in terms of an internal psychodynamic, but we can also look at that in terms of a broad cultural tendency towards objectification and stereotyping. And there, too, I think the media is implicated. And I would say far more implicated in that factor than in contributing to the more of the violence. And so as soon as, of course, someone is an object, that goes hand in hand with projection. You don't turn anyone into an object unless you're projecting something of your own inner world or some form of inner conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.